Hello, everybody. Second audio today. Scott Golden, Golden Opportunities Coaching. And if you're new, like, subscribe, comment below. If there's an audio you'd like to hear, please feel free to reach out and request it. And we will do our best to get that to you within usually a day or two. In any event, today we're going to talk about several signs of suicide, what causes suicidal ideation, and the challenges that a person who may have that condition goes through. I think it's something that I'm really passionate about. I've lost a couple of people in my life to suicide, and also I've worked with and coached several people. Used to work for a crisis intervention hotline, have worked to help set up some hotlines in my coaching practice, and also have helped to prevent close to 20 suicides over my 13-year career. So I'm really passionate about this concept. There are going to be some contradictory or controversial things said in this audio. Please feel free to comment below. I'd love to start a dialogue with you about these things. And so, because I do have some outside or non-traditional views on this topic, especially losing someone very close to me, someone I loved very much, to suicide at a very early age that actually launched my career. I can honestly say I'm really passionate about how the traditional system fails those who have suicidal ideation. And it's probably one of the reasons I do what I do and have done what I've done over the last 13 years is because I see the flaws in the existing system. Anyway, suicidal ideation and suicide prevention. Usually it comes down to pain, right? So human beings, and this is borrowed from Tony Robbins, but I fully believe in the concept of it. Human beings do anything for one of two reasons: to experience pleasure or to avoid pain. And so the pain fulcrum as it relates to suicidal ideation and suicidal thought and suicidal tendency and attempts, all of that comes back to one simple process. I'm hurting. I can't take the pain anymore. There's no one that understands how much I'm hurting. Therefore, I should end it all so that I don't hurt anymore. Certainly, that is something that is very common. Along with that comes the emotional cycle that's associated with that. That emotional cycle usually goes something like this. Okay, I've got things under control now. Finally, my life is going to get better. Followed by something, someone, a job, or outside circumstances let me down. And I am going to not be able to handle this at the end of the day. And then I feel like I'm better because I would be better if I didn't exist. I would be better if I was not, functional or not here. And then there's the regret and remorse of if a person feels that they're going to be letting other people down, which is a common reason, believe it or not. And I'm not necessarily a fan of this, to keep oneself alive for the benefit of others. Now, some people would say it's a courageous thing to do. Other people, though, would say it's a codependent thing to do because at the end of the day, one way or another, if you're keeping yourself alive for somebody else, you will end up back in that suicidal ideation cycle. Whereas if you're staying alive for yourself and or you have goals and aspirations, things you want to do, um, things you wish to accomplish or something like that, sooner or later you will find a motivation and break the cycle yourself. Whereas if you're living for somebody else, that may buy you a week, that may buy you a month, it might even buy you a year or two. But sooner or later, when that objective of living with someone else for someone else is finished, you'll be right back where you started. So I'm really not in favor of people who use living for someone else as a reason to say that they've beaten their suicidal ideation. In reality, they've put it on hold. They might have managed it for a while, but in about 98% of cases, it will return at a later point in life because somebody else cannot be the motivation behind you staying clear and good permanently. They can temporarily, but not permanently. Next up is, let's see here, illness, physical, mental, emotional illness. So if a person is physically sick or in constant physical pain, they may feel the only way out is, suicide. I have a friend who committed a suicide due to a drug overdose, and he had been on drugs for 4 years, have more and more heavily, and he had people around him that loved him, had people around him that told him to stop, went to rehab multiple times, did all the things that they said you're supposed to do, and couldn't find a reason to keep going. And what was interesting at the time was about a year before he passed, I said, this is going to end in suicide and no one can prevent it. He has made a final decision. And that's another thing that I think those who are affected by suicide and loss through suicide have to consider. Look, you're not living in that person's head, you're not living in that person's heart, you're not living through the struggle that they're going through mentally, emotionally, physically, spiritually, or all of the above. Therefore, if they've made a final decision, only they know, right? Most people with suicidal ideation do what I call imposter performer syndrome, which is they say they're fine when they're really not because it's what's socially acceptable. And ultimately, I think imposter syndrome is one of the key contributions to the reason why people who have suicidal ideation eventually succumb to their illness. It's because we live in a society that does not give people permission to go off grid for a little bit, go to a hospital or a retreat center and recalibrate. That is, rework how their mind works. That doesn't exist within our current health system. I believe if it did, we'd see a reduction in suicide rates by, I say, at least up to 50%. Now, you're going to say there's mental health hospitals. Yes. However, the current, at least in the United States, there may be countries in the world where this is not the case, but the current system only enforces go in if you are a direct danger to yourself. They hold you for up to 72 hours, which is 72 actual work hours, which usually amounts to about 7 days by the time you take weekends out. And then they regulate your medication and they send you on your happy, merry little way. The person whom I love deeply was hospitalized for 30 days, was told her insurance would not function and would not pay for any longer. They basically gave her medication, kicked her butt out the door, and on day 31, she was dead 9 days later. And I look back at that moment and say, no, I couldn't have prevented it. And yes, she had made a decision, but she had also told them, don't send me out there, I'm not going to be okay. And they sent her out there anyway. In my opinion, there was a legal suit waiting to happen there. Her family chose not to pursue it. I understand why. But at the same time, this is a case, and there are literally millions around the world over the last, I'd say the rise in mental health diagnostics has been since the 60s. So in the last, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s, 2010s, we're now 2020s. So by the end of this decade, it'll be 60 years. Over the last 60 years, we've seen so many people who really can't make it, but they are forced by the structure of our health system to try anyway. What I would propose is either a charitably funded or government funded or combination of both rehab system that focuses on brain remapping, hypnotherapy, alternative therapies, along with medication that's elongated for at least 30 to 90 days for a person who truly wants to get to the root cause of their ideation, where they do immersion therapy. Now, this happens in some rare cases, but usually a person has to have somewhere between 3 to 6 suicide attempts and hospitalizations within a 12-month period before current insurance companies will pay for this. And, I mean, look, after the psychosis of going through a hospital stay and the challenges associated with being around people you feel don't understand you, how many people are going to subject themselves to go into a hospital 3 to 6 times in a year to get some basic help, right? Like, that doesn't make sense. And so there's a major flaw in our Western system. Another thing that people who struggle with suicidal ideation often have is impulse control. Impulse control is a a neurological compound issue wherein the part of brain that deals with impulse and actions and consequences doesn't work properly. It misfires, and therefore a person's only thinking about getting the endorphins, the serotonin, the dopamine, the norepinephrine to feel better, and they actually believe in a lot of cases that they will feel better through death, and so they're not thinking about, hey, it's over, it's a permanent situation. They're not thinking about how it'll affect their family and friends. They're thinking, I want my pain to end and my pleasure to continue and my pleasure to increase. And so when that is the thought pattern, suicide becomes a really attractive alternative to living. Another is abuse survivors. If a person has abuse, chances are they have post-traumatic stress disorder or a facsimile thereof, some offshoot thereof, which means they are reliving the abusive situation again and again and again and again. And so what happens is, because they're the only person inside their head reliving this, the desire to alleviate the stress is there, and then what happens is, if suicide feels like the only situation where this is likely, then what happens is suicide becomes almost a hero's way out. This is especially true for sexual trauma victims, where they feel extremely vulnerable. Also especially true for domestic violence survivors who feel like they're just going to be attacked by the world anyway, physically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually, sexually, or a combination thereof. And so the way out is through the ending of life. Now, here's another one, and it's probably the most common. And it's the biggest thing that I see healthcare workers and mental health workers and people in the profession engage in without meaning to: judgment. The judgment that comes through the DSM, or the diagnostic I think it's statistical manual, the DSM, which I think is in its 5th iteration. It's basically a bunch of labels that says this is what's wrong with you mentally. Now, this exists for the benefit of billing insurance companies for mental health services. Yay, look who won the pony. However, when you label a person that has an emotional instability or emotional challenge, you're actually, in lots of cases, some research says up to 75% of cases, making that condition worse. If you come at them from a perspective of saying, well, this is, here's the symptoms you're exhibiting, and this isn't helping you, I don't think, would you like to live a way that's more helpful to you, versus saying you have bipolar, or you have depression, or you have schizophrenia, or you have whatever the disorder is, you're going to do more by offering to help a person than by labeling them. Now, facts are, yes, there are some people with deficiencies or trauma core injuries to the brain, the part of the brain that deals with trauma, that cannot ever recover. That does exist. But my contention, after working with thousands of people in 40 countries, would be that statistic is extremely lower than the average of what is believed. That is to say, that maybe 1 in 4 to 1 in 5 people with a diagnosed illness actually have something that is hard to treat or won't respond to alternative treatment, whereas the belief is that everybody that has a label, there's actually a statistic that says 1 in 3 people have a labelable, I know not a word, mental illness. Think about that. 1 in 3 people. That means you go out with 3 of your friends, somebody's got something wrong with them that they may not even realize, according to the way the manual works. And so that's problematic, because if we think about the 1950s and prior, the only people labeled with mental illnesses en masse were the people who couldn't function within society. Now, because the healthcare and medical industry is one of the top 3 earners in North America, and specifically in the United States, there is a whole industry around the prescription of psychotropic drugs, which sickens me, because there's money made in keeping people unwell. And that judgment that comes with getting someone on a medication to keep them unwell does more harm than good. Now, another thing to consider is unloved or conditional love. Most people that have suicidal ideation have experienced narcissistic interactions, usually with family or partners or both, and they feel that they are unloved or unlovable. If you put a person in an environment where they are cared for consistently, let's call that 30 days, and they can connect with at least two people, has to be more than one, because one can be a lucky fluke. Two, they start to think differently, that take a vested interest in them. Their bounce back and neuroplasticity of the brain increases by something like 30 to 50%, meaning that they can learn new behaviors, learn new belief systems, and thereby begin the healing process. So when a person feels unloved, it is more likely that they are going to go into a suicidal ideation phase. Now, another thing, outsiders. If a person feels like an outsider, they don't have a social group, they don't have a group of people with whom they identify, and they feel as though they're a loner and they have to go through life and struggle alone, they're more likely to focus on self-harm. In other words, if I'm going to hurt anyway, I might as well get it over with because there's no hope for me. That's a huge one as well. Compare and contrast. The illusion of competition. This is probably the second biggest contributor to suicidal ideation. There's an illusion within our current society that says we need to compare ourselves to others. It's an illusion because, truthfully, we're all born with the same things. We're born with opportunities. Some of us get more than others, better than others, but we're all born with the option of opportunity. We're all born with the power of choice. We're all born with the freedom of choice. Even those in war-torn third world countries have the freedom of choice. Now, the consequences of making that choice may be unfavorable, but they still have the power to make the choice. That being said, the illusion of compare and contrast causes problems because if we buy the illusion that there are people that are, quote, better or people that are, quote, worse than us, we try to fit ourselves into a deck of cards, which is never satisfied because there's always someone better, which means there's always something to strive for, which contributes to stress, sadness, anxiety, frustration, and a whole bunch of other things. Now, people in poverty are more likely to have suicidal ideation because our society, especially in Western culture, focuses on success being monetized. That is, the more money you have or the more influence you have to buy stuff, the more successful you are. That fundamental societal lie contributes to people feeling like if I'm not going to have my basic needs, food, shelter, social interaction with loved ones and friends and family, a good education and those things, if I don't have those things and can't get those things, my life has no meaning. Therefore, I should just go ahead and die. And that is why, if we look at the suicide rates, the one of the key contributors, especially for young people under the age of 21, is they are 3 times more likely to commit suicide if they come from a below average poverty-stricken family. Because what's the point if I'm not going to get out? What's the point of life? Which is why I contend that one has to truly consider if they can afford to have children. And I mean that in multiple ways. Financially, emotionally, are you emotionally fit? And can you provide a secure environment for them with the coping mechanisms necessary that if life circumstances change, they can cope with the potential of poverty. If not, you may, and no judgment if you feel that you want to have children and you're poor, that's your personal choice, but you may want to consider the long-term ramifications of bringing a child into poverty because you are statistically making their life more difficult, potentially, due to the association with poverty and struggle. Now, another thing to consider is if there is a history of suicidal nature in a bloodline and a family line, that increases the odds because it's seen as an acceptable way out. When it's seen as acceptable, a person's more likely to do it. This is especially true of teenagers and people between 13 and 22, in other words, ending the college age. The last one is addiction. If you are in a addictive personality archetype, you're more likely to harm yourself and think about suicide because A, when the high wears off and you're coming down, the physical pain as well as the emotional pain is too much to handle, and B, if you can't get access to your substance of choice, your body will crash on you at the same time. These are the reasons behind and beside suicidal ideation and eventual suicide. I do encourage you that if you do know somebody who's struggling in this area, or you yourself are struggling in this area, certainly reach out, talk it through. The National Suicide Prevention Lifeline is 1-800-273-8255. That is in the United States. Obviously, depending on your country, look it up, Google it real quickly if you ever feel the need. But there are certainly ways that we can improve crisis intervention, suicide prevention worldwide, and I do think that needs to be a bigger dialogue within our society. Until next time, this has been Scott Golden, life coach. Keep your feet on the ground, your mind in the moment. Until next time, everybody.